All right. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's good to see you all. I know a lot of people are off right now, but we appreciate you all joining us 1 week before most of us are going to be out on holiday breaks. Uh, I am Emily Beauregard. I'm the director of Kentucky Voices for Health and a member of the Thrive Kentucky campaign. And I'm here with my Thrive Kentucky partners today. We're all going to be presenting on the topics that we cover in our various organizations. This is our Advocacy for Thriving Communities Roadshow, the virtual edition, which we've tried to distill down to make it a little easier for folks' attention spans sitting in front of computers. But if you missed us as we were on the road this year, visiting different communities in Kentucky, this is going to be a good summary of what we've covered. And it may also just be a refresher for you if you've joined us before. So why don't we advance to the next slide, Alex? Here are the members of Thrive Kentucky. If you're interested in learning more about any of our organizations, you can click on these links when you get the slides, and you will get slides and a follow-up email. We can go to the next slide. And these are the guiding principles that really help to guide the work that we do together. Our organizations really focus on looking at ways that we can meet the basic needs of all Kentuckians through policy and systemic change. And so when you have a minute, you can kind of look through these guiding principles and see how that influences the work that we do. We can go to the next slide. Just a little housekeeping. We do have a lot of folks on the webinar today, so we ask that you stay muted while we're speaking, but please use the chat. We love to see people's questions and comments in the chat, and we try to answer questions as we go along. We don't wait until the very end. So as we see questions pop up, we'll either respond in chat or we may take a pause and answer that question. So be sure to let us know what you're thinking, how things are or aren't working in your community when it comes to some of these issues like housing and food and healthcare, childcare, and let us know, what questions you have that we haven't been able to touch on. And if we can't get to all of those questions in the next 90 minutes or in the next 2 hours, I should say, we will answer them in a follow-up email. We also have a digital folder that we could probably put the link in the chat for you now or in a couple of minutes. It includes lots of great resources and materials, and some of them we'll touch on today. We have a glossary as well, so if you are hearing an acronym that you aren't familiar with, that's a good place to reference. And then CEUs are available for certified community health workers and for social workers. And if you're interested in CEUs today, you have to complete the evaluation, which you'll get as a follow-up. So that's the process for getting those CEUs. We want everyone to take the evaluation, though, because we really want your feedback. It helps us to continue to improve on the content that we cover and all of the topics that we cover. So with that, we can move on to the next slide. Here are the learning objectives for today. We really have to include those for the CEUs. We'll go to the next slide to show you a brief agenda. So this is how we're going to kind of organize the day with our various topics. But again, please just put your questions and comments in the chat as we go. And next slide. We always like to thank our sponsors for supporting the work that we do as Thrive Kentucky. This roadshow in particular, it's given us a fantastic opportunity to really connect with community professionals all around Kentucky, visiting different communities so that we get a better feel for how these policies are and aren't working in your area and what the needs are. And we appreciate having this support too, because it helps us to cover the CEUs for free for community health workers and social workers. And if any organization present here today is interested in exploring sponsorship for 2025, you can send Kelly an email. Her email address is right there on the screen, and she can put it in the chat. And we will have more details to come. We're getting our entire schedule of Thrive meetings together right now. We have almost all the dates and times nailed down, and we're just getting a few more details in place, and then we'll be able to send all of that information out. We can go to the next slide. In the meantime, we have one upcoming event. KY Policy has their annual conference, January 24th. So there's a link to register. And everything else will be coming soon in terms of our Thrive programming for 2025. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Sheila Schuster to talk to us about advocacy and the upcoming legislative session.
Thank you, Emily, and good afternoon to you all. I'm delighted to be inside on this very, very rainy and gloomy day. But let's look at the 2025 legislative session coming up. Alex, next slide, please. So we need your advocacy in 2025, probably as much as we have ever needed it. And I want to go over why that advocacy voice should be yours. You are knowledgeable about your issues. You are an expert in your local community, more so than any legislator actually is, because you know the people, you're out there in your community working with them. And whatever your particular focus is, you probably, well, I would dare say you know more about that, whether it's housing or food security or childcare or behavioral health than 99% of the legislators. So you have something to offer them. You want to provide accurate and important information. I think one of the reasons that people don't talk to their legislators is that they often are afraid that they're going to be asked a question that they don't know the answer to. And I would urge you to see that as a golden opportunity to get back in touch with that legislator. So accept the question, tell them that you don't have that information, but that you will get it and get it back to them, and ask them the best way to be back in touch with them. So try not to leave that meeting without an email address, a cell phone number, or the name of someone in the office that you could get that information back to them. You have access to the free media, meaning not only social media, but the written press, radio, and TV. And they want to know those stories that you know when they're talking about a policy. You can rally grassroots support to your network of people that you know. You can work in coalitions so that you get lots and lots of people with different perspectives, all telling the legislators the same thing. And you're willing to speak up and to do it often. Next, please. So what happened in the 2024 election? At the federal level, as we know, Donald Trump was elected president. The Republican Party gained control of both legislative chambers in DC. Our 6 members of Congress from Kentucky were all reelected. Senator McConnell will step down from Senate leadership, but several Kentucky members may gain committee chairmanships, and I know that Brett Guthrie is the newly appointed chair of a committee that's very important to us on health. At the state level, the Republican supermajority remained unchanged in both the Kentucky House and the Senate. There was a flip of 2 House districts, but they kind of canceled each other out. There are 22 newly elected legislators, 6 in the Senate and 16 in the House. I will say that it's a little bit misleading to say 6 in the Senate, because 2 of those are House members that have moved up and are not new to us. Representative Keturah Herron from Louisville, and Representative Steve Rowland from Northern Kentucky. This is a great time to reach out and meet those new legislators. And then in an interesting Kentucky Supreme Court race, Pamela Goodwine became the first African-American woman to be elected to serve on that court. And for the first time, the Chief Justice of the Kentucky Supreme Court is a woman, and women now hold the majority of seats on the Kentucky Supreme Court. So I think that is a cause for celebration. And just a reminder that we're free of elections in 2025, although there's already lots and lots of talk about the 2026 elections, the midterm elections. Next, please. So there were 2 constitutional amendments. You didn't hear much about the first one, which was to bar non-citizens from voting in Kentucky. It was actually unnecessary, as federal law already prevents that. It passed, and it does prevent any jurisdictions, local jurisdictions, from allowing it in local races. The one about which there was much talk, debate, articles in the newspaper, and a lot of money spent was on Constitutional Amendment 2, which would have altered Kentucky's constitution to allow state funds to go to private schools. It was called a school choice vote, but in the majority of counties, there is no private school available to choose. The vote was against the amendment in every one of our 120 counties, so it was soundly defeated. However, legislative leaders are already talking about finding another path to fund non-public schools, so we need to keep an eye on that in this 2025 session. Next, please. So this will be a short session. Remember, the voters of Kentucky, by a narrow margin, decided we should have annual sessions, and they decided that in the odd-numbered years, we would have a 30-day session. It will begin on January 7th for a brief 4-day part one. So legislators will come up, they'll get sworn in, they'll get their committee assignments, and we anticipate that a number of bills will be filed in those first 4 days. I always say they work so hard in those 4 days, they get tuckered out, and then they have to take a break. And they take a break until February 4th. So they're at home for about 3 weeks without being in session in Frankfurt. They'll come back then for part two, meeting until it adjourns on March 28th. I'm going to give you the best tip I can give you as an advocate, and that is that break period between January 11th and February 3rd is a great time to be in touch with your legislators at home, and also to reach out to other legislators who may be interested in your issues. Remember that the best source of information is www.legislature.ky.gov. You could click on bills, and then when they get them posted in the 2025 GA session, you can click on any House or Senate bill by number to read its contents and to follow the action in the upcoming session. I will tell you that there's less transparency in the bills that will be introduced. They don't list the pre-filed bills, so that we actually won't know until January 7th what bills we're going to be dealing with, at least initially in this upcoming session. Next, please, Alex. So what should we be looking for? And I think we should all be very alert. With the change of administrations in DC, we need to be watchful of significant changes to our public safety net program. Just about any program that we talk about today is likely to be affected both in policy and in funding. But especially we're hearing Medicaid, Medicare, and SNAP or food security. Those who work with the immigrant and refugee communities are especially concerned because of the campaign promises that Donald Trump made about expelling tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people from the US. There already is a lot of talk about the LGBTQ community, and we think they are going to be at risk for further damage, and around criminal justice policy. So, and certainly foreign affairs and so forth, but that's not something that we typically talk about in the Thrive group. In the Kentucky legislature, there were changes in leadership that you need to be aware of. The House Republican leadership remained the same, with David Osborne as the Speaker of the House and the rest of his team. Senate leadership saw the retirement of Damon Thayer, who was replaced by Senator Max Wise, and Majority Floor Leader, and then Julie Rocky Adams, who had been the caucus chair, is being replaced by Senator Robbie Mills, as Senator Adams had run for Majority Floor Leader and lost that election. The president of the Senate is, of course, Robert Stivers. The Kentucky Democratic leadership remains the same, and that's with Senator Gerald Neal as the minority leader. And there are 3 new House Democratic leaders, Representatives Pamela Stevenson, who will be the House Minority Leader, Al Gentry, and Lindsey Burke, all representatives. Next, please. So you will remember that there are 38 members in the Kentucky Senate, and again, the distribution of R's and D's remains the same. And as I mentioned, 4 brand new senators are new in January. The distribution in the House remains exactly the same, 80 Republicans and 20 Democrats, and 16 representatives are new in January, although one of those representatives is a longtime representative serving over 20 years. Mary Lou Marzian has been reelected to serve and the House, so she's not exactly a newbie. Next, please. This is the legislative calendar. It just is helpful for you to see it in a calendar form. So that part one, the recess period, which is a great time to be in touch. Then they reconvene. They have the President's Day. February 18th and 19th mark the last days that brand new bills can be introduced in the Senate and the House. March 13th and 14th, the concurrence days. Those occur when a bill, for instance, House Bill 123 is passed by the House, goes over to the Senate, they change it, and then they pass House Bill 123. So we then have two different versions of the same bill, which we can't have. So they kind of do what I call Mother May I, where the Senate says to the House, why don't you back off and just accept ours? And the House says no, and sometimes they say hell no, and then they send it back to the Senate and say, why don't you get rid of your changes and do it the way that we did it? They always say no, and they end up in a conference committee. When they get to a free conference committee, it's kind of a scary time because they're behind closed doors and they can actually rewrite the bill completely. Whatever they come out with has to be approved by the House and the Senate. And then you have a single version of House Bill 123, which will then go to the governor. Goes to the governor during those veto days. And I think there's a misprint there. The veto days are 10 days long, so that's probably the 15th to the 26th or something like that. We'll have to correct that before we send it out. I apologize for the error. They come back and override vetoes. It's easy in Kentucky to do that. It's a simple majority of the House and Senate. And then they will adjourn. Sine die means no further days. So that's your legislative calendar. Next, please, Alex. So what else should we be looking for? Both the House and the Senate adopt new legislative rules in January, and we'll look at those to see if there's any significant changes. Those are rules about numbers of days that bills have to be posted in committee and so forth. They're kind of the Robert's Rules of Order, if you will, for the House and the Senate. A big reminder is that there are new email addresses for all the legislators and all of the Legislative Research Commission staff. It's now first name, period, last name at kylegislature.gov. There is significant construction going on at the Capitol site in Frankfort, some of which may affect parking availability and building access. So look for our KVH newly updated accessibility guide as close to the beginning of the session as we can get that information to you. And just a reminder to reach out and introduce yourself and your issues to all new legislators. Next, please. So just a reminder that you want to build coalitions. Again, the more people you have with the same message to legislators, the more impact you will have. There will be lots of rallies scheduled during the session, even though it's a short session. So keep an eye on times when you can go and support your issue with a rally in the rotunda, or perhaps a press conference, usually scheduled in one of the annex rooms. Look for calls to action on it for many of the groups that you want to belong to that are advocating for the same things that you're advocating for. Watch your social media. You can get on the Facebook page or follow the tweets. Most of the legislators use them. You can contact them that way, and you can also find out a whole lot about them and what they're thinking and doing. Phone calls and personal visits with legislators are always important. You want to plan your testimony if you get a chance to come and testify in a committee. I think it's helpful. Alzheimer's has had the purple. Mental health has had red. Those kinds of colors or even a slogan are very helpful. And then utilize the media to keep your story alive. Be sure that they have people with the lived experience of the problem so that they can highlight them and report on them. Next, please. So the most powerful statement you can make is, I am your constituent. Of course, you could only make that to your House member and your senator. Remind them that you vote. However, you can also reach out to other legislators if you work at an agency or you provide services in their district, and you could say, I work with your constituents as in my role as. So you could identify them on the Legislative Research Commission website. You want to stay in touch with them. Remember, this is not I always called it a John Calipari one and done. This is an ongoing working relationship and process. Next. So besides having the data that you need, you want to be able to put a face on the problem. We all remember stories and people much more readily than we remember the numbers. If you're interested in getting some tips on that, you could contact Holly Hudnall, who is our story banking coordinator at Kentucky Voices for Health. And remember that those local voices are most influential with your legislators. But then you want to link your data and those talking points with those local voices as someone who's experienced the problem and needs a solution. Next, please. So this is a really fraught time. It has been for the last couple of years, but I think people are shying away from getting involved because it feels very partisan. Our issues are actually not political. If you think about having enough food to eat, if you think about having access to health care, if you think about having a non-leaking roof over your head, if you think about having childcare for your child so you could go to work, those issues are really not political. The process is political, but please don't shy away from speaking up and letting policymakers know what the issues are in your community. Remember that the party holds the majority, holds the power, and they will have committee chairs and they will have a majority of the committee members. But every legislator has a vote and a voice, and you want to start with your own legislators and then work with them to let them know what you would like to see changed. Next, please. And lots of ways of staying in touch. Remember to check the legislative website. Always follow up with them. Leave a message, drop them a note that you appreciate them. And again, remember their changed email. You can call their offices at 564-8100 and make an appointment. And there's an address where you can send them something. Next, please. And remember that politics are local, so your story can be told wherever you are. Actually, the bulk of the leadership of the House and the Senate come from the rural areas of the state. So it's not the Golden Triangle, actually, that carries the weight in Frankfurt. It's actually probably where you are. Next, please. So different ways to stay in touch. Remember to call the message line. That's a really important and easy way. 1-800-372-7181. Takes you about a minute and a half to get registered with them. And then after that, you can call. They'll say, Sheila, who do you want your message to go to? What's the bill number and what's your message? And those are the three things you need to be prepared to tell them. Those switchboard operators are uniformly helpful and cheery. Stay informed. You can follow us on Kentucky Voices for Health or any of the groups that you work with, and look for the KVH bill tracker, which will be coming out in mid-January after we see the first slew of bills that have been introduced. Next. And never forget that you're part of a small group of thoughtful people that can change the world. You have great power as an advocate, and I hope that you will use it in the 2025 session. Let us know if you have any questions, please. And I'm going to turn it over to my friend, Dustin Pugel.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Schuster. We're always uplifted by the empowerment that she offers us about how to change the way things work in Frankfurt and bring the needs of the people we care about to decision makers. And then I always get to follow up with a discussion about the economy. So it always feels a little incongruous, but we think it's really important that we have an idea of what's going on with the way our economy is or isn't working for folks, so that we have a better understanding of what the needs are and how we can better fill them. So we wanted to start today a little bit with some discussion of what's going on with Kentucky's labor force. There was a whole session task force this interim around workforce attraction and retention. And there's this refrain that I keep hearing in Frankfurt that nobody wants to work anymore. And I included this little montage of every decade going back to 1894, where apparently no one has wanted to work for a very long time, which of course is not true. We've had a really sort of long history of this narrative. But if we actually dig into the data on the next slide, what we find is that a lot of people want to work. We have experienced a really dramatic downturn recently with COVID-19, where a lot of people were sent home, a lot of demand quickly dried up, and almost 300,000 people were laid off in the course of 2 months. It was the deepest downturn we've seen in generations, and was actually 3 times worse than the worst point of the Great Recession. But we responded quickly. We provided a lot of support to a lot of folks. Demand returned. A lot of people went back to work, and we now have over 90,000 more people at work now than we did before the downturn. That's about 4.6% above where we were in February 2020. That's really remarkable. We've never experienced a recovery like this in our state's long history. And I think it's a testament to what a robust response from the federal government in particular, but really all levels of government can do. And I think it's a testament to how much people really want to be able to jump in and contribute. So let's move on to the next slide. As a matter of fact, we are close to the high water mark for what are called prime age workers participating in the workforce. Prime age workers are folks between 25 and 54, so old enough that they're probably out of college and ready to be in the workforce, and not so old that they've started to retire in large numbers. We're at around 80%, just below 80%, compared to the national average of 83%, which is honestly pretty good. And after a blip during COVID, we've really recovered well, and we continue to be on an upward trajectory as far as prime age workforce participation goes. So let's move on to the next slide. But that begs the question, of course, what's going on with the other 20% of folks? Well, we have a survey actually called the Current Population Survey that tells us where these folks are. And it asks folks point blank, hey, if you're not in the workforce, why is that? And it turns out that the vast majority of folks are either home because they're taking care of a loved one, be that a child or an aging parent or a disabled loved one, or they themselves are ill or disabled, and so they're not in the workforce for that reason. To a smaller degree, there are folks who are currently going to school. They're still in school, maybe an adult learner who's gone back to reskill, or possibly somebody who's in an advanced degree and they're into the past the age of 24. They've already been able to retire, and God bless them. That's amazing. I don't think I'll be retiring before 55, but there's a 6% of Kentuckians who can. And then just 10% who are either looking for work or they're out of work for some other reason that we don't have information about. So if we sort of lump those first 4 categories together, there are 9 out of 10 workers who are out of the workforce for a pretty good reason, and just 1 in 10 for some other reason that we don't know, or they're currently looking for work. So let's move to the next slide. If we zoom out, though, not just the prime age workers, but everybody over the age of 16, and then we break it out by gender, there's a little bit of a different picture that emerges. So first of all, the largest group of people who are out of the workforce are retired. And again, that makes sense, right? Folks who are over 65 represent about 1 in 6 Kentuckians, and about 40% of folks who are outside of the workforce are folks who have been able to retire. Another 27 to 20%, depending on gender, are ill or disabled. Men are obviously slightly more likely to be disabled or sick than women. A lot of that has to do with just sort of general societal trends, but it also has to do with the fact that men are more likely to be in sort of labor-intensive industries where you're more likely to be injured. Think construction, manufacturing, or mining. a degree, to a smaller degree, a lot of folks are going to school. But what's really interesting to me is the gender difference for folks who are taking care of family. So only 5% of those who are out of the workforce are out because they're taking care of a loved one and are a man, versus women who are 20%. And so when it comes to opportunities to move people into the workforce who are not currently there, I think that's really where our main source of play is, if you will. And you're going to hear later about how difficult, for example, childcare is to find or afford. And I think that's where we have a lot of opportunity to support folks who want to be in the workforce. Not all of that 20% want to be working. Some of them are new moms who can afford to stay home with their young child. And that's great. We should support them in that. But for those who would rather be furthering a career, there may be opportunities there. The same goes for elder care and care for people with disabilities. You'll hear later about how many folks still need home and community-based services through Medicaid. That's another opportunity. So just want to point out that about 163,000 women in any given point in time are out of the workforce right now in Kentucky because they're taking care of somebody. So let's move on to the next slide. Now, to the extent that Kentucky's workforce participation has dropped in recent years, that is almost entirely explained by the fact that baby boomers make up a large portion of Kentucky's population, and they are retiring in large numbers. So if you look at that blue line there at the top, that's the number of Kentuckians who are out of the workforce right now because they're retiring. The bar graph at the bottom shows the percentage of Kentuckians who are 65 years or older, and you'll notice there's an upward trend. So in 2010, people who were 65 or older made up 13% of the total population in Kentucky. Now in 2020, well, as of 2023, they made up nearly 18%. So, this is a really significant driver for the reduction in our workforce participation rate, and that's to be expected. And as more generations move up, we'll probably see that trend reverse. Folks who are ill or disabled and are out of the workforce for that reason have declined, and the rest of those categories have pretty much stayed level. Let's move on to the next slide. So you'll remember that I mentioned the second likeliest reason that people are out of the workforce is because they're disabled. Kentucky, unfortunately, has a very high rate of disability when it comes to our other states. In fact, the only state with a higher rate of disability in the country is West Virginia. And the reason why people are disabled and out of the workforce include things like cognitive disabilities. So think of folks with intellectual or developmental disabilities. People who have issues with mobility, whether that means that they have difficulty working or they're paralyzed altogether. Folks who have difficulty with one or more activities of daily living. And then, of course, people with hearing and vision issues, as well as other types of self-care. Again, I think these are all really important opportunities that we have as a state to support them. That doesn't necessarily mean they need to be in the workforce. But if there were opportunities and they were interested, there are ways that we can provide support so that folks can be in there. But otherwise, I think it's just our responsibility as society to care for folks who have difficulties with independent living, who have difficulties with self-care, or who have intellectual and developmental disabilities. We should not be pushing them into a job. Let's move on to the next slide. Now, what's really interesting to me is that you'll hear legislators and others really complain that we have a low workforce participation rate. It's about 57%. That's the toward the bottom of the list nationally. But what happens if you take part of the state that has been chronically underinvested in and exploited to some degree, which is Eastern Kentucky, you pull that away from the rest of the state, what you see is that the balance of Kentucky, so sort of the bluegrass region westward, has a workforce participation rate that's actually above the national average. The national workforce participation rate is about 62%. If you look at sort of Kentucky without Eastern Kentucky, it's 64%. It's really just Eastern Kentucky that is struggling. And they're struggling because a tentpole industry, mainly coal, dried up starting in the 50s, but really rapidly in the 90s and early 2000s. And there really hasn't been a replacement for that. So the issue with labor force participation in Kentucky is an availability of jobs issue. If there were enough jobs available in Eastern Kentucky, Kentucky would really look like the rest of the country by and large. So when you hear about frustration with Kentucky's workforce participation, what you should hear is a coded frustration with Appalachia. And that's really what is true right now in Kentucky. So let's move on to the next slide. What our labor force what our labor force participation issue is not is a public assistance issue. Programs like SNAP, KTAP, and the marketplace insurance programs, as well as child care assistance, they all phase out as incomes rise. So they don't create what's sometimes referred to as a benefits cliff. They're actually tapered to encourage more earnings. Programs like SNAP and KTAP have a really significant level of workforce supports. So they include things like SNAP employment training, the Kentucky Works program. They'll pay for things like transportation assistance, childcare assistance, job certifications, tools, relocation assistance, you name it. There's a really robust set of supports in those programs. Medicaid is a critical coverage tool that really what we found after 2014 when we expanded Medicaid empowers people to work. It also is in itself an economic development tool. About 6% of our state's economy is Medicaid. It's really remarkable how powerful of an economic development tool it is. And also, if SNAP in particular were a hindrance to work, you would think that a larger share of eligible Kentuckians would be participating in it. But the fact of the matter is, only about 2 in 3 eligible Kentuckians actually participate in SNAP. We have one of the lowest participation rates in the country, and it's significantly lower than all of our surrounding states. So there is really not a public assistance block toward work, and quite the opposite. Public assistance really promotes work in a lot of ways. All right, let's go to the next slide. The issue is that most Kentuckians don't get paid enough to be able to make ends meet. And so that's where the safety net comes in to really support people, to catch them when they fall in hard times, and then to put them back on their feet. If you look at just what the median annual earnings full time is in Kentucky, it's only enough to sustain folks who don't have kids. As soon as you start having kids and childcare expenses come into play, you need more space, your food budget goes up, it becomes very difficult to get by in Kentucky for at least half of Kentuckians. And so that's where, again, we're going to talk about a lot of programs today that try and support people, that try and meet that gap, and really provide what the labor market is unable to provide at times for both folks who are in the workforce and outside of it. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Adrienne.
Thanks, Dustin. It's good to be with you all. I'm Adrienne Bush with the Homeless and Housing Coalition of Kentucky. Next slide. Okay, so some table setting. In April, Kentucky Housing Corporation and Bowen National Research released the first phase of their housing and supply gap analysis. And this report really supports what all of us on this call are seeing in real time, that we have an overall housing shortage in both the rental and the home ownership markets, but that the largest deficit in supply and housing supply is for extremely low-income Kentuckians, particularly on the rental side of things. Next slide. The good thing about this report is that they also break it down by county, which may be helpful for you as you are talking to your elected officials about the shortage and what that means in your community. But the phase 2 of the report actually projects out what we can expect to see by 2029 if conditions remain the same, if we don't make a turn, to correct the housing supply gap, and we could expect this gap to grow to nearly 287 or a little bit over 287,000 homes. And again, what would be driving that? The largest would be the housing for extremely low income Kentuckians. Next slide. Yay, the links work. Okay. So let's talk about rent. I just want to be real clear. The shortage of housing, particularly multifamily housing, is what is driving up rent across the board. And that results in some pretty bad outcomes, like 1 in 4 Kentuckians paying more than 30% of their income towards housing. And then when we're talking about extremely low income renters, basically 2/3 of them are paying more than half of their income. We have seen an increase in unsheltered homelessness to 5,231 Kentuckians in the last point in time count. And then from longstanding racist practices in the public and private housing sectors, we see a significant difference between our overall state home ownership rate, which is fairly high, sits at around 71%. But for Black and Brown Kentuckians, the home ownership rate has remained pretty stuck at 38%, which means they're more likely to be renting. So the graphics on the right side of the slide have really show the housing affordability crunch over the last 7 years. 2017, the National Low Income Housing Coalition published its Out of Reach report. Kentucky was number 50 in terms of affordability. This is this ranking is if you are at the bottom of the list, you are considered more affordable. It's the state housing wage at that time was $13.95 per hour. Over the last few years, we've hovered in the 40s. But then by the time 2024 rolled around, we are down to number 38. So this is not a list that you want to move closer to number 1, unfortunately. Our state housing wage to afford a 2-bedroom home to rent is now over $20 per hour. Next slide. All right. So I wanted to show a couple of snapshots kind of showing the trends, what we are seeing in homelessness in Kentucky. The bottom line is about 10, 11 years ago, we were sitting right above 5,000 Kentuckians experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And we started to see significant reductions with some targeted and smart investments. However, those investments and homeless assistance grants could not keep up with the rising rents that we are seeing across the board. And so now we are starting to see a fairly dramatic increase in people experiencing homelessness. The pie chart on the right shows that about 16% of the folks counted were in Lexington, about 1/3 were counted in Louisville, but over half the folks counted were actually in one of the other 118 counties in the state. Next slide. We can also see this trend happening among the larger population of homeless children and youth, which is collected through the Kentucky Department of Education. We see that we still have over 20,000 kids who are considered homeless by our school districts. Next slide. All right. So brief recap from the last legislative session before we pivot to the upcoming one. We want to share out some good news, and that is that we did have legislation to make IDs and birth certificates for people who were born in Kentucky and experiencing homelessness to be free, to be no cost. And so working with the Transportation Cabinet and the Department for Vital Statistics, we do have step-by-step training video and materials available in that link on that slide. And if you are interested in helping clients access identity and residency documents, we have a survey for you. Next slide. Okay, so during the interim, the legislature established a Kentucky Housing Task Force because housing has become top of mind for so many people. The legislature wanted to take the opportunity to study the issue between June and November. They really focused on the supply issue, and they met monthly and heard from a lot of different folks, mayors, other elected officials, advocates, all sorts of people. The folks on the right side of the screen are the ones who served on the housing task force. You can see it's a little bit Louisville heavy, but that there is some representation from other places like Henderson, Paris, Paducah. Legislators can use the final task force report to inform 2025 and 2026 legislation. Next slide. So what might we see in upcoming legislation? Basically, that the housing supply shortage is both in small and large communities, which was an education for some legislators. And that basically, to really dig into the housing supply shortage, flexible housing funding is needed. Some of the options discussed are creating a flex funding pool for construction of affordable housing, maybe some other types of housing, matching dollars for the state's shelter programs, creating a housing tax credit that would mirror the federal housing tax credit that is used to develop multifamily housing across the United States. And then modernizing and fully funding our housing trust funds. We have an affordable housing trust fund, we have a rural housing trust fund, and those are doing good work. They just aren't scaled up to meet the demand of the shortage. We really need for there to be a link between economic and infrastructure initiatives to housing. We need to think carefully about what growth in communities means, what climate change induced disaster, what that presents, and how we pair those things together. And then lastly, we heard from a lot of folks about the need for planning and zoning reform, which doesn't sound real exciting, but it definitely is necessary. Things like reducing parking minimums, minimum lot sizes, things that can help drive down the cost of just building. Next slide. All right, so lastly, we have some resources for you. We do our best to maintain a list of homeless assistance contacts across the state. There is still money from the American Rescue Plan Act for the Homeowner Assistance Fund, as well as the Team Kentucky Eviction Diversion Program. We always want to uplift LIHEAP crisis assistance, which has varying windows throughout the year, and then legal assistance for renters who may be facing eviction or fair housing issues. Those links are also on the slide. And with that, I will turn it over to Jessica.
Thanks, Adrienne. Hi, I'm Jessica Klein, and I'm a policy associate with Kentucky Center for Economic Policy. With what you've heard today so far from Dustin and Adrienne, it should be no surprise that hunger or food insecurity is an issue in Kentucky. In fact, we ranked 7th in the nation. Nobody chooses to be hungry. It is a poverty choice. It is a policy choice, and people born into poverty are faced with impossible decisions every day, like choosing between rent, like Adrienne was mentioning, and food. And for those not living in poverty, we know many of us are just one layoff or medical emergency away from needing assistance. So I'm going to talk about that assistance today. Next slide. So again, we ranked 7th in the nation. There are over 700,000 people facing hunger in Kentucky and over 200,000 that are children. We also ranked 2nd in the nation in terms of those 50 to 59s, who are older adults that are hungry. And we have some of the top counties, the top 10 out of 25 in the nation in terms of food insecurity and poverty. Next slide. Even with those high rates, we do have many food assistance programs that help to supplement budgets and provide help with groceries. I'm going to talk about a few of these today. Our number one tool against hunger is SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and that reaches low-income families with a gross income over 200%. But it does require some citizenship information in their applications. There is the Women, Infants, and Children program for breastfeeding or pregnant or postpartum moms and children under 5. And then the National Free School Lunch Program for students to get free meals in school. and then the summer EBT program, which provides grocery money during the summer months when child food insecurity is the highest. Next slide. So a little bit about our SNAP program. As Dustin mentioned earlier, we are reaching only 2 in 3 Kentuckians that are eligible. So we rank 46th in the nation in terms of our reach. But even then, we're still reaching over 586,000 Kentuckians. The average benefit is about $174 a month for an individual. So again, this is very much a supplemental program. People are just getting a little bit of help with their grocery budget. And that money is spent quickly in communities. You know, people use this money almost as soon as they get it to buy groceries in their local community. So again, those food retailers, those farmers markets are getting that benefit. I mean, it's stimulating local economies as it's spent. The program is also very receptive to the economy and policy changes in the program. So you'll see this chart on participation really shows a lot of those changes. We see a dip after 2013, after we recovered from the Great Recession, followed by where you can see in 2020, the pandemic, there's an increase there. So we're getting back to our current steady level after that point. Next slide. So I mentioned some of the policy choices that impact the program and its participation. And one of those is called the work reporting requirement, and that's for adults in households 18 to 54 without a child or a documented disability in the home. And that requirement says that people have to submit additional paperwork to show that they're working. And if they miss 3 months in a row, then they lose their food assistance. And what we know is that that doesn't do too much to improve the work metrics that are used to measure working Kentuckians, but it does add additional red tape for people to lose their benefits. Luckily, there are some exemptions and 3 new ones as of last year. So those are people experiencing homelessness, those aging out of foster care, and veterans. So we definitely want people to check out this one pager in our resources on that information. Next slide. And a little bit about the counties that are exempt from this requirement. So this paperwork barrier was across the state, but there are exemptions based on economic factors of different counties, so they can be exempt or waived from this requirement. This is information from the last year, and I will say we just had a waiver approved that said 117 of our counties would be waived. So there are 3 that are not exempted from this requirement, so their food assistance is still at risk based on that requirement, and that is Oldham, Scott, and Fayette. Next slide. So what should you know about fraud in SNAP? This is often a question we get when we talk about the SNAP program, so I wanted to bring it up. What I want you to know about fraud in SNAP is that there is fraud in SNAP, and agency error, though, far exceeds the intentional fraud and kind of what people think about when they think of fraud. And these rates of trafficking are very low, less than 1.5%. And really, a lot of the fraud we saw in SNAP decreased once we switched to cards a long time ago. So what we would like to say is that the type of fraud we do see in SNAP is called EBT skimming. This is a national issue. And what we've seen is people, it's basically kind of a credit card scam where you have these card readers that read your card, and people are able to get their benefits taken away, or skimmed is the term they use, based on this credit card fraud. So there was a fix for this nationally, where people were able to receive replacements for any benefits that were skimmed in 2022 through 2024. That ended in October federally. This is a discussion happening at the federal level to be included in the Farm Bill. You know, that decision is being made as we speak. Those conversations are happening. So if that's something you're interested in, you can definitely continue to do that advocacy to your state level legislators about that issue. But that's something we'd like to see addressed either in the Farm Bill or at the state level if it's not addressed nationally. Next slide. I also wanted to mention a cost of living adjustment that happened in October. Some people may have seen a change in their benefits. So SNAP is based on a calculation. The number of benefits you receive is based on your income, your household size, and several deductions. These deductions change every year in October based on a cost of living adjustment. This year, it was decided to take internet expenses out of that deduction cost. So some people did see a reduction in their benefits starting in October. There are other deductions that you can apply for to make sure you're receiving the most benefits that you need. That's things like dependent care deductions, shelter costs, those types of things. There's also a standard medical deduction for older adults without a disability or a person with a disability of any age. So definitely make sure that you're applying for those deductions. And we have a handout in our resources with that information as well. Next slide. A little bit about the WIC program. As I mentioned, this is for pregnant, breastfeeding women, infants, and children. We primarily reach infants with this program, over 100,000 in Kentucky. Again, we're not reaching as many as we could, only about 56% of people eligible. So definitely want to share that, you know, kinship care families, fathers, grandparents, they can all apply for this program too. So I know that the name is a little bit of a misnomer because more families are eligible for this program. This definitely helps to pay for some of that very expensive formula, but also some nutritious food for young families. So a good benefit to pay attention to. Next slide. A little bit about summer EBT. So this is the program that provides grocery money during the summer to make up for school meals. You know, kids aren't getting those school meals during the summer, and so we see really those childhood food insecurity rates skyrocket. Definitely really important because as food insecurity in households with kids has these lifelong health and economic impacts. So definitely a group of people we need to be reaching and helping feed. So this past year was our first year implementing summer EBT. This is, again, a national program kind of built off of previous example pilot projects and the pandemic supports that we saw. So this program was first implemented last year, and we reached over, you know, almost 400,000 kids. So we'll definitely be paying attention to those application periods coming next summer, but you may hear about this from your local school district between now and then. More information coming soon. Next slide. A few resources here, and then our next slide is a link to KFAN. So if you're interested in this food assistance, you want to work on that farm bill, you can join our KFAN here and learn more about our action network. And with that, I will turn it over to Emily.
Great, thanks, Jessica. Hi again, everyone. I'm going to talk to you all about childcare and childhood education. We can go to the next slide. I want to start by just saying that, you know, kind of level setting, childcare is the industry that supports all other industries. If you really think about it, it is essential for working families and for our economy. And Dustin did a fantastic job of kind of explaining that. Just how many families struggle with working when they lack childcare and how many want to be working, and also, you know, what it costs to take care of a family. But what he didn't really go into is that high quality childcare also pays dividends when it comes to education and school readiness, and also when it comes to child development and long-term health outcomes. And so for all of these reasons, we need a childcare industry that is high quality and accessible and affordable to the families who need it. The problem is there's not enough of it, and we're at risk of losing more. And so I'm going to cover a little bit of what the sort of current, the current childcare kind of environment is in Kentucky, and what some of the struggles are for providers and for families. So we have now, as Dustin said, 1 in 5 Kentucky prime age workers with children between 0 and 5. 76,000 of these working parents aren't working because they're caring for a child, and they're wanting to work. These are people who actually are looking to be in the workforce but can't find childcare that they can afford. or maybe it doesn't exist in their community at all. And 1 in 3 parents have had employment disruptions due to childcare. So that's a whole other issue where families who maybe do have childcare or they have kids that are in school, they still are experiencing disruptions to their employment and to their ability to be productive at work. And so this is why it really is an economic issue as well as one that is related to education and health. And as he said, more women are out of the workforce for this reason compared to men. We can go to the next slide. I mentioned that childcare is really hard to find. Sometimes it's, just finding affordable childcare, but in many communities, there's simply not a center or maybe a childcare home that has space available for a child. And we've seen this decline happen within 10 years, prior to the pandemic. It leveled out as federal funds kind of came into Kentucky during the pandemic to stabilize the childcare workforce. And we are now, post those federal funds, we're on the other side of this. The funds are no longer coming to Kentucky to support the workforce. And that means that we have a lot of providers who are looking at, how they're going to be able to keep their centers open, how they're going to continue staffing. Before the pandemic, providers were regularly paying their workers $8, $9, $10, $11, $12 an hour. With that federal funding, they were able to increase wages up to $12 to $16 an hour now, is what we often hear from providers. That's still not competitive with other low-wage jobs in communities. And so they have a hard time recruiting and retaining workers, especially whenever you're looking at quality and safety for your kids. And that's kind of a pressure that has just grown this year. And the flip side of that is increased tuition for families. And while some families are able to figure it out and continue to pay those higher rates, a lot of families just simply can't make the number work, that math work. And they have to make that decision to either quit a job and stay at home or put their kids in a place that isn't as safe. And no family should have to, face that decision. We can go to the next slide. Over half of Kentucky kids live in a childcare desert, and this map shows you where those deserts are currently. It's about 50 counties that are considered deserts, which means that more than 3 children are in need of every 1 slot that's available in that county. But you can imagine that the situation is a whole lot better for families in counties where there are 2 kids that need every 1 slot. I mean, this is the counties that have the least childcare, but by no means do those white counties have ample access to childcare. And we have about 163,000 childcare spots in Kentucky for children of all ages, but we have many more children who need spots. We can go to the next slide. So I mentioned that childcare is unaffordable for a lot of families, especially with rising tuition. And when you really look at the numbers, it is kind of shocking to realize that childcare costs on average what in-state college tuition costs. And in some cases it costs more, but this cost is coming early on in a family's life when they haven't had as much time to save like we do whenever we know our kids are going to go to college in 18 years. And it's also earlier on in people's careers, which means that they're not making as much and they haven't saved as much. So we're putting the most sort of pressure on our younger families who are earlier on in their careers and expecting them to be able to shoulder this cost on their own or with very little assistance, instead of looking at this as really an economic benefit that supports all of us. We can go to the next slide. And childcare assistance, while it is available, we have the CCAP program in Kentucky. It's the childcare assistance program where people who are families who are income eligible can get assistance with the tuition for childcare. That only helps people when there's a CCAP eligible slot available. And not all providers take CCAP. They don't all participate. And it only helps families who, of course, are eligible for CCAP. So that assistance is fantastic for the families who are able to use it. And we have a little over 30,000 kids right now who are enrolled in CCAP. And for their families, this is absolutely essential for keeping those jobs and for being able to take care of their families and make ends meet. There are so many more families who are eligible for CCAP and just can't participate because there's not a child care center in their area that has a spot open for them and takes CCAP. And so we really need to work on getting more providers to accept CCAP, and there are some reasons why they don't, but also looking at other ways that we can just make childcare affordable for every family. We can go to the next slide. Kentucky doesn't spend a lot on childcare. When you compare what Kentucky spends to on K through 12 education, and you look at childcare, you realize that we're spending 13 times less on children 0 to 5, when that's the same period of time that, you know, we see 90% of brain development. And so we're really not investing in this crucial period of time for brain development, for learning, for socialization, that, you know, has long-term consequences. And we would like to see our legislature consider, you know, those early years, 0 to 5, as part of the continuum of early childhood education and, you know, just education in general, so that we are starting to invest, you know, 0 to 18. We can go to the next slide here. So this past legislative session, while we asked legislators to really help to kind of to fill the gap in that federal funding that was ending, which was about $300 million a year. We asked for $150 million a year, so half of that, to maintain stabilization programs for those providers to keep their doors open, to keep paying their employees those slightly higher wages and some of the other benefits and things that they were able to do with that federal funding when they had it. But the legislature decided to focus primarily on CCAP. So we got additional funding in the budget for CCAP, about $39 million in 2025, $50 million for 2026. And it also included some additional funding for a few other things, including an innovation fund and paying for background checks and things like that, things that could support providers in various ways. But it really didn't get to some of those needs that providers were sharing with them in terms of just making ends meet and keeping their workforce. But the thing that came out of this session that I think was most impactful is allowing childcare providers, the teachers in classrooms, to participate in the CCAP program, to essentially be able to bring their kids to work with them and have them in a safe place getting quality childcare while they're working and watching other kids. And that really has been innovative, and it's something where Kentucky has been leading the rest of the country. A lot of states have been looking to us to see how we did it and to replicate that. And I think that that's something that we absolutely want to see continue. And we also, during the pandemic, raised the income eligibility for families to participate in CCAP at 85% of the state median income. And that was maintained in the budget, which, again, fantastic. But that doesn't mean those income eligibility families always have access to CCAP if there's not a provider in their area. So still lots of work to do. And we can go to the next slide. ECAP is another area where it's another innovation where we are really looking at ways to bring employers into the mix, into the solution. So a state share sort of assistance program where an employer commits to paying so much, that's matched by the family and that's matched by the state to help offset the cost of childcare. And we need more employers participating in this and really looking at how they can support their employees, their workforce, to be able to afford childcare while they're working. So this is the program to do it. There's not a lot of participation, though. We need more employers to really get off the sidelines and put their money where their mouth is when they talk about supporting the workforce and their employees. And so there's some information available here. I can tell you that Kentucky Voices for Health participates, and it's been a great program for us. And we're happy to continue to share information about that with anybody who's interested. And the next slide is just a little teaser that we have a childcare explainer that we're updating. It's coming soon. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Schuster again to talk about behavioral health.
Thank you, Emily. And let me put on my psychologist hat to talk to you. Behavioral health is basically a general term that includes mental health and substance use or addiction issues. First slide, Alex, please. So you all have heard about ACEs, not the kind that you play cards with, but the adverse childhood experiences. And I really like this chart because it shows you the things that are evaluated in determining how many ACEs a child or an adult has experienced. So those above ground things, substance use, mental illness in the home, divorce, incarceration. Kentucky ranks very high in the number of kids who have one or both parents incarcerated, maternal depression, physical and emotional neglect, and so forth. And then it also looks at the root causes. And I like this slide because the Thrive community really tries to address those root causes. So you've heard some about housing already. You've heard some about poverty in our economy. We know that there's discrimination and violence, community disruption in many of our communities, and then a general lack of opportunity for the people of Kentucky. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about trauma in particular. Next, please. So you've heard about the social determinants of health. There are also social determinants of mental health. And again, these are many of the things that we've talked about today. I guess if I had a magic wand and I could cure one thing, it would probably be to raise the income level of all Kentuckians so that we were not so mired in poverty, because out of poverty comes so many of these things: underemployment, food insecurity, housing instability, poor neighborhoods, education inequality, poor access to health care. So again, when you're thinking about mental health and addictions, think about some of these social determinants. And Medicaid and the MCOs are focusing much more on social determinants of health and looking at the Medicaid subscribers and trying to help them get access to health care. Next, please. So unfortunately, Kentucky is another one of those Kentucky uglies, we call them, where we rank very poorly in terms of something. And it's we rank high, unfortunately, in suicide and self-harm statistics. So almost any one of the groups that you're concerned about probably falls into that category. The most common means is by firearms. And so we think of firearms as being linked to mass shootings and so forth, but it is the most common means. If someone is caught in the throes of a suicidal downturn or tailspin, and there's a firearm available, the chances of their successfully completing that suicide increases sixfold. So we really want firearms to be locked safely away. We also have a lot of farmers in Kentucky, so that I refer you to raisinghopeky.com as a great source of information in helping our farmers deal with depression, isolation, and suicide. And then our LGBTQ youth, while sexual orientation is not necessarily linked to suicide, the discrimination and mistreatment that they encounter, even in schools, but in our society, leads them to be at a higher risk, particularly the trans kids. So the Trevor Project is an excellent resource, and I have that link for you there. Next, please. I want to talk for just a second about LGBTQ kids. Senate Bill 150 saw the passage, was passed in the 2023 General Assembly. It is universally seen as the most negative bill attacking trans kids. It put a ban on gender affirming healthcare and certainly made our schools much less safe and supported, not only for trans kids, but also for other students with sexual orientation differences. It makes it more difficult, although it was not banned, for them to access mental health treatment. The good news, this past summer, Governor Beshear made a bold step that we very much appreciated in signing an executive order banning the negative practice of what's called conversion quote therapy, which is not really therapy. Senator Alice Forgy Carter used to call it conversion torture, and it is that. So we thank Governor Beshear for protecting trans kids and LGBT kids. Next, please. So we've been asked repeatedly in the road shows, that I put this slide in, older adults make up 1 in 6 in our population in Kentucky, and they have a significant number of behavioral health issues. So if you are in that sandwich generation where you're caught between raising kids and also caring for your aging parents, you know that they are suffering grief over lost loved ones. There's sometimes cognitive impairments. There's financial concerns. They're more likely to have chronic illness and pain. And their big concern is about the loss of independence and self-sufficiency. In 2023, Kentucky ranked 48th among all states in the percentage of adults age 65 or older who reported that their mental health was not good 14 or more days in the past 30 days, which is not great to hear. So we really need to be paying more attention to our older folks. And again, they need stimulation, they need companionship, they need access to health and mental health care, and they may need the help of a home and community-based waiver called an HCB waiver in order to stay in their home. So I direct you to the Medicaid, the DMS website to look up that waiver and see whether you might help someone get the care that they need to be able to stay in their own home or in their community. Next, please, Alex. So the good news is that we have been working diligently for the last couple of years on a number of waivers. These are state specific. Each of them has to be approved by CMS and DC. One that has been approved and I think is going to make a significant difference is what we call our reentry waiver. Actually, you lose access to Medicaid services when you're incarcerated, and this waiver lifts that ban and allows people to get services and to get connected with their MCO at least 30 days or 60 days prior to release. They are going to start this in mid-2025 in our state prisons and also with our juveniles who are in the juvenile detention centers. Eventually, we hope that they will put it into the county and city jails. Another one that we've been working on for about 20 years is a waiver that would give supported housing to people with severe mental illness. And this is a waiver that looks at people with what we call SMI, severe mental illness, like schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, and also those with significant addiction services. So it offers a lot of housing supports and education, medication management, non-medical transportation, and for those who are caring for a person, a loved person in their family with SMI, some respite. We are praying quite literally that this will be signed by CMS in the next 30 days so that we can begin implementation in mid-2025. And then we recently had a waiver submitted that is due for approval that would give more inpatient days to individuals with SMI or addictions, and also give medical respite follow-up care when they're discharged from the hospital. So all good things, stay tuned. Next, please, Alex. So I hope you're all familiar with the 988 line. It's over 2 years old at this point, launched in July of 2022. And that's the place to call if there's any concern about suicide or a mental health crisis or for information around that. And they have some prompts If you're a veteran, dial 1, for Spanish speakers, dial 2, and for those who are LGBTQ, dial 3. But please circulate that number to everyone you know. Next, please. So our community mental health centers were established in the 1960s in statute. They are the behavioral health public safety net. They're nonprofits. They provide mental health and addiction services, also intellectual and developmental disability services. And they answer all of those calls, which is just wonderful. We're actually one of the leading states in getting those calls answered locally. Next, please. This is a wonderful resource, findhelpnow.org/Kentucky. Use it to help people get treatment, to know what's available in mental health, substance use, recovery housing, or access to naloxone. It is updated regularly, and it's just an absolutely invaluable resource. Next, please, Em. So keep an eye on yourself. You all are doing tough work, advocacy work and community service work. Know when you're getting kind of frazzled, and get some rest, get some help if you need it. Always better to get help early on. And next, just a couple of crisis lines and so forth for you for reference. And I think that's the end of, yeah, Kelly, turning it over to Kelly for maternal and child health. Thank you.
All right. And I know we have to refresh here real quick, so I'll give Alex a chance to catch up. Some of this will be a lot of repeat, refresh information that you've heard. You can go on to the next slide, Alex, about Senate Bill 74 from this past legislative session that we lovingly call the Momnibus Bill. Am I frozen or let me see. Uh-oh.
Just a sec.
Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and start talking because a lot of these things have either gone into effect or will be going into effect shortly. Namely, will be the new benefit for lactation consultation and supplies. This is going to be coverage as a benefit under those who use Medicaid for their health care. And something we like to remind folks of is that every single year, without fail, you can go on to the next one, Alex, 44 to 48% of all births every single year are covered by Medicaid. So I like to say that because that means Medicaid on so many things that you're hearing here today, but for the delivery and improvement of the lives of our moms and babies, it is always uniquely poised to really, really impact and make a mark. So it put in some tight parameters because those who have breastfed know what breastfeeding is like. You don't really have a whole lot of time to wait when things go wrong and you need new supplies or consultation quickly. So now there's some parameters for our Medicaid managed care organizations to adhere to. And based on where an individual lives, if they don't feel that they can accommodate the request in that amount of time, individuals now have a mechanism to seek that care and supplies on their own for reimbursement, which is great. Next slide. The Lifeline for Moms, which will be a professional helpline, and to kind of reinforce and underscore everything that Dr. Schuster just shared with you. We have so much more awareness, and we are day by day breaking down the stigmas on why and to what extent our families need support, especially when it comes to the presence of perinatal mood and anxiety disorders. This is a current public comment period, so if you yourself are a professional, know professionals, or just have an opinion, let me know. Email me after today's program because there is an option by the end of this calendar month to participate in impacting how this regulation is designed. Because what it will do effectively is create a direct line for any provider in the state to speak with one of two behavioral health, a psychiatrist and a psychologist who are licensed in Kentucky, who have a little bit more wherewithal in these sorts of matters and can quickly discern whether or not someone needs resources, maybe a quick referral, if it's an urgent matter versus an emergency matter. And we will hopefully continue to grow this space. I would like to see a lifeline for moms available for moms. But as you can see there, just to remind ourselves of the abysmal rates we currently live in, our maternal mental health scorecard nationally just improved this year to a D. So if that says anything on how far we have to go, just want to point that out and go to the next slide. This is new. As of all of the previous Roadshow content, you've only been hearing about the process or that it would be happening. But since our last Roadshow stop, the Cabinet for Health and Family Services, as mandated through Senate Bill 74, completed their study to examine doula care and services as an option available for Medicaid reimbursement in Kentucky. They did submit that to the Legislative Research Commission. I've linked it there. We want to share it with as many people who would like to read and review and participate in this process, because what will happen now is the legislature will take that information and more or less develop it into a policy option. That doesn't mean that this coming session a bill will be filed. That's obviously the dream, but dreams don't necessarily always come true in Frankfurt. But it's at least a healthy starting point on why and how we can advance that conversation so that we can better support our pregnant, birthing, and postpartum Kentuckians. You can go to the next slide. I think the next one is hands. So I'll go ahead and start talking about it. But the expansion of Kentucky's hands program just went from pregnancy to 2 years from pregnancy to 3 years. And these are individuals that are located in every single county. It does not matter the type of insurance you have, or if you don't have any insurance at all. They are available to all families, and the program just got expanded. They come to where you are, be it in a country club or if you are unhoused and living in your car or elsewhere. They really are the walk of meeting people where they are. So we're really excited that they got expanded. The pregnancy special enrollment period, which Priscilla will share more details about, this will be going into effect in 2025. I need to actually update that little typo there. At one point, we did think it was going to be happening earlier this year, but starting in January. Individuals who become pregnant and are not eligible for Medicaid, Medicare, and if it is outside of a traditional open enrollment period, will now have the opportunity to enroll in healthcare, which is really exciting. Next slide. So transitioning a little bit to some public health content to support our moms and babies. And for anyone who has kids right now, I don't think I have to remind you that 'tis the season for lots of things. After Thanksgiving in Jefferson County alone, we heard and learned last week that chicken pox seems to be spreading a little bit in Louisville, as is COVID and whooping cough. So this is just your reminder. And for our moms and babies, we're still really trying to get some additional education about that maternal RSV shot, because it is still so new and it's only available for a limited amount of time for a limited part of the pregnant population. You can go to the next slide. This is some repeat content, but we feel it's really important. If you joined us last year at all, you heard from the American Academy of Pediatrics National, that's our country's pediatricians, toolkit on how to have these conversations a little more compassionately. We're coming out of a pandemic where immunizations are a little polarized, but it is still so essential that we support our children and moms and growing families, especially when it comes to routine vaccines. So on to the next slide. This is a continuation of that logic on why it's so important that we get good information to families. This is our health literacy approach to immunization recommendations that is a little more simple to follow. It's no diss at our providers and science community. We love them, we need them, but this is just a little easier to follow for your average busy family just trying to get kids around all day long. And it is also available in Spanish. Go on to the next slide. And this is just one final slide to underscore how many lives and how much money is saved every single year, thanks to modern medical science and immunizations in particular. We know that it keeps families and children out of poverty. It's fewer sick days from work, chronic illnesses, lifelong consequences, and disabilities. And so the more information that we can routinely get to families to support them, especially at peak respiratory season, the better. And I believe that is all for me. And I'm going to pass them. Oh, nope, I'm a liar. Sorry. The Vaccines for Children's program, just to continue improving access, we want to make sure that children who happen to be uninsured, unfortunately, or underinsured, if their insurance does not cover the full cost of a routine immunization, that they still have access to the care they need. So this is just some content and resources for those families that you all can use. And I believe that might be it now. Man, sorry, I changed my slides up right before. So Kentucky Medicaid providers enrolled in the Vaccines for Children's program, your rates recently changed due to federal guidelines. This is not a state limitation or change. It is linked there under the heart where it says new. And pharmacists continue to be a catalyst, an access point for our families. They can immunize children down to the age of 5, which is really handy. And that is thanks to policy that the legislature put in place this year, and it went into effect in July. I won't say I'm done now. I'm just going to be safe and go on to the next slide. And with that, I'll pass it to Priscilla.
Thanks, Kelly. Hi, everyone. I'm Priscilla Easterling, the Director of Outreach and Enrollment for Kentucky Voices for Health. I'm also a connector, and we're going to cover healthcare. So next slide, please. So when we first talk about healthcare in Kentucky, there are 4.4 million Kentuckians, and the great news is that the vast majority have some type of insurance. Now, our uninsured right now is around 250,000. There's a huge asterisk next to that number. That number is from the last ACS community survey that was from 2022. And so that is before all of the Medicaid renewals restarted and folks started to lose their coverage. So we know that number is likely higher. We just don't have a good idea of what that number is right now. But when we look at the insured population, again, some of that might be a little different, but more than 4 million Kentuckians have some type of insurance. There's public insurance, and that's about 2 million folks. And when we talk about public, that's Medicaid, Medicare, TRICARE, other veterans benefits, or private health insurance, which is about 2.78 million. And those are your job-based insurance plans, any individual plans on the market. You call up any insurance company and say, hey, give me some health insurance. And then there's also the Connect Marketplace, which has enrollment around 85,000 right now for 2025, which is very exciting. So again, the great news is that most Kentuckians have some sort of health coverage, but we know that there's still work to be done. Now, my favorite to talk about of all of these is Medicaid. We love Medicaid. It is an incredible safety net program all over, but especially in Kentucky. There are currently about 1.33 million Kentuckians enrolled in coverage, and it really covers Kentuckians and folks from birth, so from cradle to grave. It covers more than 50% of births in Kentucky, covers over 70% of nursing home stays, and it really is a fully comprehensive, wonderful, free of charge coverage for all members. So we love Medicaid, and it really is that incredible safety net for folks that need a little extra help to make sure that they can live a healthy life. Next slide, please. And so within Medicaid, there have been a lot of changes in the last year. Now, we've talked a bit about Medicaid renewals. They restarted post-pandemic last April. And over the last year, all of the adult population who've been enrolled in Medicaid, they had to go through their annual renewal process. And so as of May, 6 months ago, that's crazy. As of 6 months ago, for adults Medicaid renewal process, that's sort of a back to normal annual cycle. Folks every year just have to go back through that process and submit documentation, or sometimes they can be passively renewed into that coverage. For children, it's a little bit different. Last year, when all of those renewals were restarting, Kentucky really took action to protect kids' coverage and to make sure that kids did not unnecessarily lose that coverage while all of the all of the pandemic related flexibilities were sort of being unwound, as we call it. And so they took action to protect children's coverage by pausing their renewals. Now, originally they were supposed to restart this past September 2024, but the state has decided to, with approval from CMS, they have decided to continue pausing or to keep children's renewals paused until all of the pandemic flexibilities end, and those end at the end of June 2025. And so for children enrolled in Medicaid beginning July 2025, they're going to just go back to a normal annual renewal cycle. Now, with adults, there was a lot of talk about like batching cases and, having to spread out that entire population over a condensed time period. But for children, they don't have to do that. So wherever, whenever children are currently scheduled for their annual renewal process, it'll just turn back on, and there are not going to be any sort of special redistributions or case movement or anything like that. So the really important thing there is to make sure that all contact information is up to date in Connect. Make sure you can do that by logging into Connect yourself, call the call center, work with a connector who can help update that contact information. And you can also reach out to your provider at the doctor's office and ask them to check KY HealthNet for the actual renewal date. It's super important that that contact information is up to date, because if your address isn't up to date and they send the notice to the old address and you don't get it and you don't respond to those notices, it's possible that you could lose your coverage. So definitely make sure that you keep that information up to date. And if you need any help doing that, connectors are available in all 120 counties, and they're a free resource, and they can help you make those changes. And we also do have some a great one-pager, two-pager, it's front and back, Medicaid renewal explainer that's available in both English and Spanish. That is linked in the slides and on KY Loop as well. Next slide. Okay, so this is an example of those notices that go out to members when it's time for their annual renewal. So just keep a lookout for those. It is really important to read through them and ask and make sure that you know what those notices are asking you to do. For that first notice of eligibility, you normally just have to review it. It's usually just extending you for 12 months, and you just need to take note of it. But for the request for information and renewal packet, you do have to submit information back to the state. So it's really important to read through those notices, make sure you get them, and submit any information that's requested by the due date that's listed on the notice. Next slide. Thank you. And so as we talk about Medicaid enrollment, we can really see where things dropped off. Again, this is when Medicaid renewals really restarted last April. You see that sort of precipitous slow decline. And it has really leveled off because folks are still are still being deemed eligible for Medicaid. There is still new casework, new applications every day, every week. And so Medicaid continues to be a very strong program with high enrollment, and continues to protect so many of our friends and family and neighbors. So next slide. So if you lose coverage, the first thing you want to do, there is a 90-day reconsideration period. If you fail to turn in those documents, if you uploaded documents and those disappeared, or you went to the office and they just didn't get uploaded to the case, you can immediately go in and report any changes to your case on connect.ky.gov, call the call center, or again, work with a connector. You can submit those documents up to 90 days after the loss of coverage and connect, and they'll be able to reinstate coverage back to the loss of coverage, back to the day of that termination, so there's no gap in coverage. Next slide. We've heard a lot of issues with Medicaid renewals. Like I mentioned, folks taking documents to the DCBS office or trying to upload them and connect and them just disappearing. We've heard about RFIs for residency really tripping some folks up. Again, it's super important to make sure all your contact information is up to date. But if you've done everything you're supposed to do, or you're just not sure what to do, definitely start with reaching out to a connector. If you have any issues completing that renewal, you can escalate those cases to us. We work directly with the state to identify some of the technical and enrollment problems that happen in this process, and we work to try and make that a better, smoother process overall. But in the meantime, we can make sure that you get your coverage reinstated, or resolve any issues that you might have while you're trying to complete this renewal process. So next slide. And fun reminder that Medicaid vision, hearing, and dental services are here to stay. They were implemented last year. They were officially this year. They are in place and available indefinitely. So I like to say they're here to stay. And we know hundreds of thousands of Kentuckians have been able to take advantage and utilize all of these services. And I love to hear that. So 300,000 enrollees received over 356,000 vision services. That's just incredible to me. So let's keep rolling. There's also a new NEMT regulation that helps expand access. One of the things that we've heard a lot for NEMT, which is non-emergency medical transportation, is that a lot of times folks, they might be eligible, but they just have problems because there's someone else in the household who has a car, or they have a car, but it's not operable, or the person in their house is using it to go to work. So this year, a new regulation was finalized that changes the rule from enrollees don't, if they don't have a vehicle in their name, if the member calling does not have a vehicle in their name, or it's not operable or usable. So there's one car for the household, and that car is going with someone else to work or to school or for another errand. You can also still be eligible for an NEMT ride, and you can get an attestation from a lot of different folks to say, like, yeah, actually this car is not operable, or it's not usable, it's not available. And so that helps make it more accessible for folks to be able to get those rides and be eligible for those rides. So very exciting. Next slide. There's also a great NEMT explainer that is available on KY Loop. It's also linked here. And then we also have a simplified one that will be uploaded on KY Loop 2. That one's more consumer facing and just a very simplified folder, a simplified explainer. Next slide. Also, a couple of other Medicaid initiatives that we really care about. One is the Beneficiary Advisory Council. There's more information here, but I do want to plug that there is the back forum that is on the 18th. There's one right now that just ended. There's another one that is on the 18th if you were unable to join, which all of you were, because you were here with us instead. So there's a lot of great information about what that Beneficiary Advisory Council will look like, and how you can get involved. Next slide, please. All right, here is the new value added benefits comparison chart. The 2025 version is out now. We've talked about Anthem is no longer going to be an MCO as of 2025. And so this is for the 5 remaining NCOs. There's also a great FAQ that's available that we will send out in the follow-ups about for members who are currently enrolled in Anthem and what that transition will look like for them going into 2025. All current Anthem members will be split between Humana and United Healthcare, and that will happen automatically. Members won't have to do anything, but there will still be that opportunity to change MCOs throughout the year if for some reason you want to change your MCO. But this is a great chart. And as always, my favorite thing to talk about is open enrollment. I'm going to run through this really quickly. You can apply for Medicaid anytime during the year. It's always open for enrollment. Right now is the marketplace open enrollment that runs through January 15th. Right now, the first deadline for coverage for January 1st was December 15th, yesterday, but the state has extended another 3 days to the 18th. So if you apply for coverage, apply for Medicaid for marketplace coverage between now and by midnight the 18th, they will still honor a January 1st start date. You'll just need to call the call center and they can manually change that for you, or work with a connector and or an agent, and they'll be able to have the KHBE manually change that for you. Medicare open enrollment just ended last week. And again, if you need any help, reach out to a connector or SHIP coordinator. Next slide. Once open enrollment ends, there are lots of options to get coverage. There's a great explainer here. But back to Kelly's point, the new pregnancy special enrollment period will be in effect in Connect beginning January 1st. It will be a little bit of a manual process. There's a question that the state will manually process for you to deem the special enrollment period open, but by the end of the month, it will be automatic. So when you go in there and you report that you're pregnant, it will automatically apply that special enrollment period, and you'll be able to enroll in coverage, which is very, very exciting. Next slide. And if you've ever looked at the marketplace before, especially if you have employer-sponsored coverage with dependents or spouse, definitely check out the marketplace again. There's a new fix that's been in place since 2022 that makes it more affordable for families now, and folks who have spousal or dependent coverage. Those folks are your spouse or dependents are now eligible for premium tax credits on the marketplace, and so it can be a more affordable option for families. Definitely check it out. There's a calculator tool and a great explainer also linked here to check out, and it lives on QI Loop as well. Next slide. Also beware, the only place to enroll in an ACA approved plan is connect.ky.gov. Don't just Google health insurance. You're going to get nothing but spam calls. It's not a good idea. Connect.ky.gov, work with a connector. Yeah, and just be safe and smart. Next slide. We did back in October on Halloween, we talked about the scary part of surprise medical bills. So with our partners at Kentucky Equal Justice Center, and there's a webinar that is linked to our YouTube. So go check that out as well if you want to know more about the No Surprises Act and medical debt. Next slide. A little bit more about the No Surprises Act. It really just bans those surprise bills and prevents balance billing. Next slide, please. There are protections for both insured consumers and uninsured or self-pay consumers. So protections for everyone, and it's an incredible legislation that really is helping to protect folks from those surprise medical bills. Next slide. trying to run through this. And last but not least, we always need great new connectors. So if you are interested, there is a complete your application link right here. Or if you just have questions about what it means to be a connector or want to just ask some questions, always reach out to me and I'm happy to help. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dustin.
All right, I'm going to round us out today. We've had a lot of really good conversations about housing assistance and healthcare, public health and food assistance. And the thing about all those is that we have to pay for them, right? And I think to a large extent, our budget, which is the way we decide how we pay for things, is a statement about what we value. And if we look at the most recent budget, the one that was passed this last legislative session, went into effect in July. We have some good things, right? So we paid for a lot of new Medicaid waiver spots that I think we've mentioned before. We finally gave state workers another raise. So we have unfortunately a history of not paying them very well. But the last three budgets or last 3 years, we've been able to actually give them a cost of living adjustment to try and catch them up. We did a little bit for childcare, as Emily mentioned. It wasn't enough, but it was certainly more than we've had up to this point. We slightly improved our funding for post-secondary education, as well as K through 12 school transportation. We held Medicaid harmless, essentially. We made up for some decrease in federal funding that we anticipated so that we could continue to offer a baseline of services. We also funded K through 12 education at about the same levels we did last year. A few things were either left out or cut. One is that housing advocates asked for a lot more than what we ended up getting. As you saw, Adrian showed, we have a really severe shortage in our housing stock. But even worse than that, we have a really severe shortage in affordable housing. And so we didn't really offer what we should have for that. Emergency funding was capped so that the legislature has to be called back into session when we hit that cap after some sort of a natural disaster or something else like that. And then finally, even though the legislature funded for the planning of mobile crisis units, they ultimately didn't end up funding the implementation of them. And so we had to pull a contract that we had set up with a organization that was going to be able to provide those services. And in the end, we didn't receive that. So let's move on to the next slide. Now, typically we have one executive branch budget that includes both operational expenses as well as some what are called capital expenses. These are usually one-time things that we pay for. But this year, in addition to that, they had another what they call one-time spending budget. And it was actually a combination of House Bill 1 and Senate Bill 91. It was almost $3 billion worth of spending out of our budget reserve trust funds, our state's rainy day fund. That was used for hundreds of projects. Some of those were statewide, some of those were local. It also included a $62 million hole that they left from the sort of executive budget, the one I just talked about. They plugged that with funding here. And really, that's unusual. They've never done it like this before. But the reason is that they have an ultimate goal of being able to cut the income tax. In order to do that, they have to meet certain triggers. And the only way they can meet those triggers is by doing it this way. So I've got this cartoon here of moving the goalpost, if you will. They really chose to change the rules that they set for themselves so that they could cut the income tax. So let's move on to the next slide and talk a little bit about that. So the income tax is now, it used to be our largest source of revenue, but because we've cut it the last several years, it's now our second largest source of revenue. And when we cut it, it's actually a pretty big windfall to our wealthier neighbors here in the state. For every 0.5 percentage point reduction in the income tax, it's about a $5,500 check cut to our wealthiest neighbors. Those are folks who earn on average $1.4 million per year. For about 1 million Kentuckians, so our poorest neighbors, there's no benefit because people who are below the poverty line don't pay an income tax in Kentucky. So it really is not the benefit that I think a lot of legislators claim that it is. For sort of like middle income Kentuckians, we're talking about $139 to $250 per year. I mean, for my family, that's right around one trip to the grocery store. It's not a huge impact. Let's move on to the next slide, though. But in order to hit these triggers, what the legislature has to do is they have to underspend. So they have to basically have left over the equivalent cost of a 1 percentage point reduction in the income tax. That's over $1 billion each fiscal year. And so for 5 of the past 6 fiscal years, starting in 2026, looking backwards, we've left a lot of money on the table. So in the midst of all of these needs that we've been talking about, needs for childcare, needs for housing, needs for healthcare, needs for public health, we've had all of this money that we've just chosen not to spend. The Budget Reserve Trust Fund is set to hit about $3.5 billion by 2027, which is far more than what we typically would need to be able to have enough to weather a downturn. Let's move on to the next slide. The cost of cutting the income tax, on the other hand, is very high. So if we look at the cost of going from a 5% income tax, which is where we started several years ago, to a 3.5% income tax, which is what they're planning on doing the first week of session, that's around a $2 billion reduction in our state revenue. And I know that sounds like kind of boring, but $2 billion is a lot of money. That's $2 billion we could have every year. And to make a comparison, we spend about $2.6 billion a year on Medicaid as a state to cover the lives of 1.4 million Kentuckians. We spend about $2 billion a year on our base funding for K through 12 education. It's double what we pay for all of our community colleges and public universities combined. And it's far more than what we spend on behavioral health. It is a very expensive cut, and it's a permanent cut. We don't get that money back, and it's very unlikely that the General Assembly will come back and raise our taxes again. So it's important to remember that even though we are basing essentially what are temporary increases in revenue on these tax cuts, the tax cuts themselves are permanent. Let's move on to the next slide. I just want to say that the result of this is already starting to be felt. So revenue from the income tax has gone negative the last 3 years, and that's no surprise, right? We've reduced the rate, and so we're bringing in less. So far this year, this fiscal year, we brought in almost 19% less, a little over 18% less than what we did last year. The result of this is that the Kentucky Office of the Budget Director is anticipating a $200 million shortfall by the end of this fiscal year. We've only had 4 shortfalls in the last 50 years. Well, actually, we've only had 3. This would be the 4th. And those other 3 have been during recessions, during the 2001 recession and during the Great Recession. We've never had a shortfall outside of a recession. And as I said at the beginning, we're actually doing pretty well in terms of job growth and income and so forth. Sales tax is also likely not going to keep up with initial estimates through our consensus forecasting group. So I say all this to say, we've talked a lot about the needs of our Kentucky neighbors. We've talked a lot about the needs of the programs that we are using to help them, but we have to pay for all of that. It's really important that we preserve the tools that we have to be able to do that, including our income tax. So as the legislature comes back in January, I really hope you will urge them to make a choice that really benefits all of us, not just our wealthiest neighbors. And with that, I'll hand it over to Emily.
Thanks, Dustin. And I know that we're at time. Just a quick reminder, we have an Advocacy 101 training coming up on January 13th, which is a great way to get to either refresh your skills or get new skills as you're approaching the session. All of our KY Loop explainers. This is our kind of draft list of dates and locations for our Thrive Kentucky Roadshow and webinars in 2025. And we'll get more details out to you soon. And thank you all for being here. We would love for you to complete the evaluation, give us your feedback about today, and also make sure to complete it if you need CEUs. I hope you all have a happy holidays and that everyone stays safe and warm over the holidays. And we will see you again in January. Thanks, everybody.